There's a little book left on desks by managers, handed out by corporations, slipped quietly into the bags of people going through hard times. Over 30 million copies since 1998. It's barely 100 pages. And it's about mice. Welcome to Whispering Pages. If you're here just for the summary, skip to the next chapter. For the rest of us, let's ease in. Let the stillness of the room hold you. The pre-sleep mind is open in a way the daytime mind rarely is. What settles in tonight tends to stay. Tonight, Who Moved My Cheese? By Dr. Spencer Johnson, a tiny parable about change that became one of the best-selling business books ever written. So let's begin. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. And let's whisper through this one together. Spencer Johnson spent much of his career writing short, powerful parables. Stories simple enough to absorb in an afternoon but layered enough to think about for years. He trained as a physician, worked as a writer, and eventually became famous as the co-author of The 1 Minute Manager, one of the best-selling management books of the 1980s. That book, also written as a brief parable, sold 15 million copies by teaching managers 3 simple practices in the space of a lunch break. It showed Johnson something important about how people actually absorb and apply ideas, not through long arguments or dense frameworks, but through stories they can see themselves in. But Who Moved My Cheese? Was different from everything he'd written before. It was more personal, more urgent. Johnson had watched people around him, colleagues, friends, family members, and if he was honest, himself, resist change over and over, holding tight to what they had even when it had clearly stopped working. He'd watched people cling to jobs that were making them miserable because change felt more frightening than staying. He'd watched relationships outlast their usefulness by years because neither person wanted to be the one who named what was happening. He wanted to write something that would make that pattern visible. Not preachy, not theoretical, just visible, easy to recognize, maybe even a little funny. The book was published in 1998 and sold modestly at first. Then it started spreading through companies. Managers handed it to teams before difficult announcements. Executives bought copies by the case and distributed them during restructurings. It traveled through word of mouth the way most business books never do, because it didn't feel like a business book. It felt like something a friend handed you because they recognized something in you that you hadn't yet named in yourself. Over the following years it sold more than 30 million copies worldwide, was translated into dozens of languages, and showed up in hospitals, military barracks, schools, and the bags of people who had just lost their jobs. The book opens with a framing device that feels like something you'd hear at a reunion. A group of former classmates gather in Chicago the day after their high school reunion. They're catching up, laughing, comparing where life has taken them. The mood shifts when one of them, a man named Michael, says he wants to share a story. A funny little story, he calls it, that changed the way he thinks about change. When a big change came to his business, he didn't know what to do, and the company nearly failed. Then he heard this story. And after that, things improved. The story itself has 4 characters. 2 are mice, Sniff and Scurry. 2 are tiny people, beings the size of mice who look and act very much like humans, named Hem and Haw. All 4 of them live in a maze and spend their days searching for cheese. And the book is honest about this from the first page. Cheese is a metaphor. It stands for whatever you most want in life. A good job, a loving relationship, money, a sense of purpose, good health. The maze is where you look for those things. Your workplace, your family, the community you live in, the circumstances of your life at any given moment. All four characters search. All four eventually find a large supply of cheese at a place deep in the maze called Cheese Station C. It's a wonderful discovery. More cheese than any of them have ever seen. And for a while, everything is very good. Sniff and scurry, the mice do what mice do. They keep their running shoes tied together and hanging around their necks, ready. They arrive early each morning and check the station carefully, sniffing the cheese, assessing the supply, noting whether anything has changed from the day before. They don't build identities around the cheese. They don't assume it will last forever. They don't tell themselves a story about what it means that they found it. They just pay close, daily attention to the reality in front of them. Hem and Haw begin the same way, rushing to the station each morning, grateful, excited. But over time, their relationship to the cheese changes. They start arriving later. They put their running shoes away, thinking they won't be needed anymore. They hang up their jogging gear and put on slippers. They build a social life around the station, bringing friends by to admire what they've found. They decorate the walls with sayings, "Having cheese makes you happy, and we deserve this cheese." Hem grows proud, possessive. He's worked hard. It's his. What the book captures in this early section is something most of us recognize even if we don't name it: the way abundance turns into assumption. The quiet shift from gratitude to entitlement. The moment when a good thing becomes something you stop seeing clearly because you've stopped being willing to imagine life without it. One morning, Sniff and Scurry arrive at Cheese Station C and find it completely empty. They aren't surprised. They've been watching the supply shrink for weeks, checking it every day, noticing each small change. And so when it finally runs out, they do what comes naturally to creatures who've stayed alert. They look at each other, put on their running shoes, and head back out into the maze. No meeting. No mourning. No one to blame. Just movement toward what comes next. When Hem and Haw arrive that same morning, the scene is entirely different. Hem shouts. He rages. "Who moved my cheese?" He yells, over and over, as though volume might undo what's happened. He declares the situation unfair. He insists someone has done something wrong. He says the cheese will come back if they are patient enough, loyal enough, if they simply refuse to accept that it's gone. Haw is quieter but no less frozen, standing at the entrance to the empty station in shock, unable to move. Days pass. Then weeks. Every morning, Hem and Haw return to Cheese Station C, hoping the situation will somehow be different. They try everything except the one thing that would help. Hem decides the cheese must be nearby, perhaps behind the wall. So they get tools. They chisel and hammer their way through the wall of the station. They find nothing. But that doesn't stop them. They start earlier, work harder, stay longer. After considerable effort, all they have is a large hole in the wall and the same empty station they started with. They experience the painful gap between activity and productivity, expending enormous energy in exactly the wrong direction. Here the book makes its first deep cut, and it's worth sitting with. Because Hem and Haw aren't stupid. They aren't lazy. They aren't even, in the ordinary sense, cowards. What's trapping them is something far more familiar: identity. The cheese stopped being just a resource a long time ago. It became proof. Proof that they were successful, that they were the kind of people who deserved comfort, that the world was fair and made sense and rewarded the right things. Leaving the empty station isn't just going to look for food. It's admitting that the story they've been telling about themselves might no longer be true. Hem's entitlement runs deepest. He says, at one point, plainly and without apology, that they didn't cause this problem, so they should get something out of it. They're owed their cheese back. They're entitled. And this is the book at its most precise, because entitlement here isn't mere arrogance. It's grief dressed up as anger. It's the refusal to let go of a world that was genuinely good to you, because letting go means accepting, fully and finally, that the good thing is over. Meanwhile, the book makes sure we know where Sniff and Scurry are. They've gone deeper into the maze, up and down corridors, trying every station they can find. For a long time they find nothing. But eventually they arrive somewhere new, Cheese Station N, and find the biggest supply of cheese either of them has ever seen. They squeal with delight and settle in. They're already well fed by the time Hor eventually arrives. The contrast isn't accidental. The mice didn't succeed because they were smarter. They succeeded because they didn't confuse the cheese with their identity, didn't assume the world owed them stability, and didn't wait for clarity before moving. Hor is the first of the two little people to feel the crack. Somewhere in the weeks of waiting, he notices himself laughing quietly, almost despite himself, at how absurd the situation has become. Two people in running gear, returning every morning to an empty room, digging holes in walls, arguing with the silence. The mice had moved on immediately. What would happen, Hor wonders, if he just left? He starts painting a picture in his mind. He imagines new cheese somewhere out there, in a corridor he hasn't been down, at a station he hasn't found. He can almost taste it. And the more clearly he sees that image, the more real and possible it begins to feel. But when he tries to bring Hem along, Hem refuses. He says he's too old for the maze. He says it's dangerous. He says he wants the original cheese back, his cheese. And so, slowly, they separate. Hor pulls on his running shoes and steps into the unknown. Hem stays behind, waiting for a world that is not coming back. Hor's journey through the maze is the emotional center of the book, and Johnson is honest about what it actually feels like to begin again after waiting too long. It is not triumphant. Not at first. Hor is physically weakened from the weeks he spent standing still. He gets lost. Some corridors dead end. He backtracks. He wonders more than once whether he should turn around and return to Cheese Station C. Empty, yes, but familiar. At least there he wouldn't be alone. The fear of the unknown, the book suggests, often keeps us in the known long after the known has stopped having anything to offer us. But something shifts as he moves. He starts to feel better, not because he's found cheese, because he hasn't yet, but because movement itself has a quality that stillness doesn't. His making choices again. His choosing a direction, even when he isn't sure it's right. His back inside his own life rather than standing outside a version of it that has already ended. He starts writing on the walls as he goes. Little sayings, reminders to himself, and also breadcrumbs for him, should his friend ever find the will to follow. These wall messages become the most quoted lines in the book, and they arrive one at a time, each one earned by the experience that preceded it. What would you do if you weren't afraid? If you do not change, you can become extinct. Movement in a new direction helps you find new cheese. When you stop being afraid, you feel good. The quicker you let go of old cheese, the sooner you find new cheese. Noticing small changes early helps you adapt to the bigger changes that are coming. Old beliefs do not take you to new cheese. Imagining yourself enjoying your new cheese leads you to it. Each of these sayings marks a moment where Hor's thinking has shifted. not just his behavior but his underlying belief about what is happening to him. That distinction is the book's real subject. Hoare used to believe, without quite knowing he believed it, that change was something imposed on you, something unfair, something to resist until it reversed. Out in the maze, that belief slowly loosens. He begins to see that change isn't the exception. It's the nature of the maze. The cheese has always been moving. The stability of Cheese Station C was never permanent. It just felt that way because he stopped paying attention to reality and started trusting his assumptions instead. There's a moment that hits particularly hard. Hoare realizes that the cheese at Station C hadn't disappeared overnight, the way it felt to him. It had been getting smaller for a long time. Toward the end, it was growing old, losing its taste. It may have had mold on it. He simply hadn't let himself see it. He'd wanted it to be fine, because noticing would have meant facing something he wasn't ready to face. The change hadn't ambushed him from outside. He had looked away from what was already happening. He finds small amounts of new cheese as he travels, bits and pieces scattered through the corridors. Not enough to stop and settle, but enough to remind him that the maze isn't empty, that there is something out there worth continuing toward. And with each small discovery, the fear that had been driving his paralysis starts to shrink. What he'd imagined waiting for him in the unknown was always worse than what actually existed. The most frightening part of the maze turned out to be standing still in the part he knew. When Hoare asks himself what he would do if he weren't afraid, something opens up. He begins to see the corridor ahead of him differently, not as a threat but as a possibility. He keeps moving. He smiles, sometimes, in the dark. He realizes he hasn't felt that way in a long time. Not the absence of fear exactly, but the feeling of being more alive than afraid. Of choosing, rather than waiting to be chosen. One of the most poignant moments is when Hoare doubles back to find Hem and offer him bits of the new cheese he's discovered. He returns with pieces in his pocket, hoping Hem will taste them, hoping the evidence of something better will be enough to move him. Hem refuses. He says the new cheese isn't what he's used to. He wants his own cheese back. Hoare walks away grieving for his friend, but also clearer in himself than he's been in a long time. You can leave trail markers. You can return with gifts. You can draw the map as carefully as you know how. But you cannot want the change for someone else more than they want it for themselves. Eventually, Hoare rounds a corner in a part of the maze he has never visited before and finds Cheese Station N. Enormous, piled high with more cheese than he has ever seen, varieties he doesn't even recognize, all of it fresh. And there, settled in and clearly thriving, are Sniff and Scurry. They've been there a long while. They arrived long before Hoare because they left the moment the old supply ran out, without spending weeks at the empty station demanding an explanation. Hoare eats his fill. He takes off his running shoes and ties the laces together and hangs them around his neck, the same gesture he made when he first arrived at Cheese Station C, back when things were still new and full of possibility. He is ready for next time. Because there will be a next time. The cheese will move again. That's not pessimism. It's just how the maze works. He writes one final summary on the largest wall of the new station, what the book calls the handwriting on the wall, and it distills everything the journey gave him into a set of principles. Change happens. They keep moving the cheese. Anticipate change. Get ready for the cheese to move. Monitor change. Smell the cheese often so you know when it's getting old. Adapt quickly. The quicker you let go of old cheese, the sooner you find new cheese. Move with the cheese. Enjoy the adventure. And then the last line, which closes the circle, Be ready to change again and again, because they'll keep moving the cheese. Not once, not twice, again and again. The maze doesn't stop. The book then returns to Chicago, where the classmates are now unpacking what they've just heard. This discussion section is one of the most underappreciated parts of the book, because it does something the parable alone cannot. It shows the story actually landing in real people's real lives. Carlos admits he was clearly hemmed during an unexpected job loss years ago. He didn't want to see the change coming, and when it arrived he refused to go looking for anything new. He thought he had a good reason why this shouldn't happen to him. Nathan talks about his family's chain of small stores, destroyed when a large competitor arrived in their market. They had watched the same thing happen to similar businesses in other cities. The signs were clear, but they stayed put and hoped it wouldn't reach them. We tried to ignore what was happening, he says, and now we're in trouble. Jessica describes a previous company that was offered the chance to put their entire encyclopedia onto a single computer disk and sell it at a fraction of the cost. Everyone resisted. The sales force depended on the high price. The business model was built around it. A competitor said yes. Within a few years, the original company was struggling badly. The cheese hadn't just been moved, it had grown old and started to rot. They just refused to smell it. Michael then shares something about what happened in his own organization after everyone encountered the cheese story. He'd asked people which character they were, and something interesting shifted in the culture. In most organizations, when a change is announced, the social pressure runs against it. People say it's a bad idea, because agreeing with the dissenters feels safe. But after the cheese story became shared language, that peer pressure changed. Nobody wanted to be identified as hem. Nobody wanted to be the one who was hemmed in and left behind. The story didn't force anyone to change. It made a certain way of being visible, and gently, collectively, a little embarrassing. One of the most quietly moving contributions comes from Becky, who describes her son's fury when the family relocated for her husband's job. He'd been a competitive swimmer and the new school had no swim team. He was devastated and angry. Years later, he fell in love with the Vermont mountains, took up skiing, competed at the college level, and now lives happily in Colorado. If the family had shared this story together, Becky says, they might have saved everyone a great deal of stress. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because naming what was happening, this is our old cheese, and somewhere ahead of us is new cheese, might have helped them move through it together rather than against each other. There are honest things to say about the book's limits, and it earns that honesty. Who Moved My Cheese is a thin book with a single idea, and it presents that idea without much nuance. The core message, notice change early, let go cleanly, move towards something new, can flatten out real complexity. Not every change is good. Not every loss should be released without grief. Sometimes the cheese really did belong to you and the situation is genuinely unjust. A worker whose job is eliminated after 30 years of loyal service. A person whose relationship ends not because they were being a hem but because circumstances were genuinely painful and the loss was real. The book doesn't make much room for that. Hem is clearly the wrong way to be. Whore is clearly the right way. And the gap between them is presented almost entirely as a matter of willingness and attitude, not as something structural, grief-shaped, or simply human in its slowness. There's also a version of the book's organizational application that deserves some skepticism. It was widely distributed by companies going through layoffs and restructurings, sometimes handed to employees just before difficult announcements. It's worth asking whether, in those contexts, it was genuine preparation for change or a tool to manage how people responded to decisions that had already been made above them. The message can be pointed in a harmful direction. Your discomfort with this change is just you being a ham. That's a very different use than the book intends, but it's a real one, and the book doesn't protect against it. Who Moved My Cheese? Also isn't the book for everyone. If you already move easily with change, if you're naturally a sniff or scurry, you may find the single idea bailer board. If you think carefully about structural causes of hardship rather than individual responses to it, the book's framing will feel limited. And if you're in the middle of a grief process that deserves to be honored at its own pace, being told to move faster toward the new cheese may feel like exactly the wrong message at exactly the wrong time. The book it most naturally points toward, if you want to go deeper, is Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. Switch covers the same territory, but it gets into the real mechanics of why change is hard even when you want it, even when you can see perfectly well that the old cheese is gone. The Heath brothers introduce a central model. The rational mind is like a rider sitting on top of a large elephant. The rider can see the destination, can plan the route, can articulate all the reasons why the new direction makes sense. But the elephant is far more powerful, driven by emotion, habit, and inertia, and you can't simply instruct the elephant into movement. You have to work with its nature. You make the path clearer and less frightening. You find small early wins that give the elephant confidence. You shape the environment so the new behavior is easier than the old one, rather than requiring constant willpower to sustain. This maps directly onto what Hoare actually does in The Maze, without either Hoare or Johnson naming it as such. Hoare doesn't change because he makes a rational decision to be flexible. He changes because he starts to laugh at himself, which releases something. He changes because he paints a vivid picture of new cheese, which makes the destination feel real rather than abstract. He changes because each small discovery along the way gives him enough energy and confidence to keep going. His journey works because he stumbles into the right emotional conditions, not because he got control of his thinking. Switch gives you the tools to create those conditions deliberately, for yourself and for the people around you. It fills the space the cheese story leaves intentionally open, which is the practical question of how. But even with those limits held clearly in mind, Who Moved My Cheese does something that most books about change don't. It doesn't argue with you. It doesn't make a case or present data. It shows you 4 small characters in a maze, gives them names and habits and fears, and trusts that you'll recognize yourself somewhere in the picture. And most of us do. Most of us have been hem, standing at an empty station, certain the cheese is coming back, doing everything except the one thing that would actually help. Most of us have also been Hoare, frightened, delayed, but eventually willing to put on our shoes. The story doesn't judge you for either. It just holds up the mirror, very quietly, and lets you look. The question it leaves you with tonight is a gentle one. Is there a cheese station somewhere in your life right now, somewhere you keep returning out of habit rather than hope? A situation, a relationship, a version of yourself that has been empty for a while but that you haven't quite been willing to leave yet? You don't have to decide anything tonight. Just let the question rest somewhere quiet. Sometimes that's exactly where the real changes begin. Sleep well. And we'll see you at Whispering Pages for the next one.